Religious extremism refers to the radical beliefs and actions of individuals or groups within a religion who advocate for the use of violence, intolerance, or oppressive measures to promote their ideologies. It is important to note that religious extremism is not representative of an entire religious community, as it constitutes a small minority within any given faith. Nonetheless, it poses significant risks to global security, social harmony, and human rights. Islamic State, ISIS emerged in the early 2000s and gained global attention for its violent and brutal tactics in the name of establishing a caliphate. The group's extremist ideology sought to enforce its strict interpretation of Islamic law, leading to the persecution of religious minorities and widespread human rights abuses. Example: ISIS carried out numerous attacks on civilian populations in Iraq and Syria, leading to the displacement and suffering of millions of people. Al-Qaeda is a militant Islamist group founded in the late 1980s, known for its extremist beliefs and involvement in numerous terrorist attacks worldwide. The group's goals include driving out Western influence from Muslim-majority countries and establishing Islamic states governed by its radical interpretation of Sharia law. Example: the September 11, 2001, attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., were carried out by members of Al-Qaeda, resulting in the deaths of thousands of innocent civilians. Boko Haram. Boko Haram is an extremist Islamist group based in Nigeria, known for its violent campaign against the Nigerian government and its efforts to establish a strict Islamic state. The group has carried out kidnappings, bombings, and attacks on civilians and schools. Example: the abduction of over 200 schoolgirls from Chibok in 2014 drew international attention and condemnation, highlighting Boko Haram's brutality. Taliban. The Taliban is an extremist Islamist group that originated in Afghanistan and seeks to establish its interpretation of Islamic law in the country. The group's rule from 1996 to 2001 was marked by severe human rights abuses, particularly against women and religious minorities. Example: the Taliban's destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan, ancient cultural heritage sites, demonstrated its extremist ideology's disregard for non-Islamic history and culture. Hindu extremism in India. Hindu extremism in India has been associated with certain right-wing organizations that seek to promote a Hindu nationalist agenda. These groups have been accused of inciting violence against religious minorities, particularly Muslims and Christians. Example: attacks on religious minorities, such as the 2002 Gujarat riots, have raised concerns about rising religious intolerance in India. Buddhist extremism in Myanmar. In Myanmar, there have been reports of Buddhist extremism manifested through violent attacks against the Rohingya Muslim minority. Buddhist nationalist groups have been accused of promoting anti-Muslim sentiments and contributing to human rights abuses. Example: the military crackdown on the Rohingya in 2017 resulted in mass killings, rape, and the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims. Jewish extremism in Israel. Jewish extremism in Israel has been linked to some far-right groups advocating for the establishment of a Greater Israel, often at the expense of Palestinian rights. These groups have been involved in attacks on Palestinians and religious sites. Example: attacks on Palestinian civilians and their property in the West Bank have been attributed to extremist settlers. Christian extremism in the United States. In the United States, some Christian extremist groups have advocated for theocracy and promoted discriminatory practices against marginalized communities. These groups often espouse anti-government and anti-immigrant rhetoric. Example: the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, carried out by Timothy McVeigh, was motivated by a mix of anti-government and white supremacist beliefs. Sikh extremism. Sikh extremism emerged in the 1980s and 1990s in India, with some seeking an independent Sikh state, Khalistan, through violent means. The period saw significant violence, including attacks on government and civilian targets. Example: the 1984 Operation Blue Star, aimed at flushing out Sikh militants from the Golden Temple in Amritsar, resulted in significant casualties and damage to the holy site. Far-right extremism in Europe and the United States. Far-right extremism encompasses a range of ideologies that promote nationalism, xenophobia, and anti-immigrant sentiment. Some far-right groups have targeted religious minorities and immigrants. Example: the 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand, carried out by a white supremacist, resulted in the deaths of 51 Muslims. Addressing religious extremism requires a multifaceted approach, including education, social integration, interfaith dialogue, and the promotion of religious tolerance and freedom. Governments and civil society must work together to combat hate speech, discrimination, and violent ideologies while upholding human rights and the rule of law. International cooperation is crucial in sharing intelligence and best practices to counter the global threat posed by religious extremism.